This evening, Christina Romer, Professor Romer, will reflect on the theme of inequality and the global economic crisis. Where are we, just under 10 years on from what Australians called the GFC and what the world grappled with in so many complex ways? There's no one better placed than Professor Romer to reflect on this question. Not only is she a distinguished macroeconomist and economic historian, she was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors to President Obama during that very fateful time. So she is someone who is both a first-hand participant in finding the solutions that saved the world economy and thinking about how issues around disadvantage and inequality were to be addressed as part of that. As some of you may know, and for those of you who don't, Professor Romer is the class of 1957 Gareth B. Wilson Professor of Economics at the University of California at Berkeley. She is a program leader at the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and widely recognised in various honours, including the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship, the National Science Foundation, and she is also a member and fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So I won't spend longer on introducing her. She has many other accolades to her name, but we're here to hear her. So please join me in welcoming her to share her thoughts.
Now, the 2008 financial crisis is also burned in my mind for another reason, which Roz alluded to, because just after the presidential election in in November 2008, I received a somewhat cryptic email. It came from a name that I didn't recognize, and it just said, "I'd like to talk to you about the Obama transition." And I was about to delete it when my husband had the good sense to Google the name of the sender, and he came back and said, you might want to answer that. That person is the head of economic personnel for the Obama administration. And so the next thing I knew, I was on my way to Chicago, first to meet the president and then to be introduced as part of the team that President Obama was assembling to try to deal with the crisis. And so what had previously been a largely academic interest for me suddenly was the central focus of every waking moment. So this evening, as I suggested, what I want to do is to talk about what the crisis did to the economic well-being of families throughout the world. And in thinking about the consequences of the crisis, I want to look at both the immediate impact, but also some of the longer-lasting effects, some of the things that we're still living through now some 9 years later. And you'll see that though the post-crisis recession is technically over for many countries, in most countries, there's still important lingering pain for many families. I also want to discuss the worldwide policy response, so to give you a sense of what policymakers got right and what perhaps we could and should have done better. And finally, I'm going to try to be more positive and talk about where do we go from here? Are there things that we could do now to try to further repair the damage and make some of the people that are still being harmed by the crisis whole again? All right, so that's where we're headed. Let me start with sort of a quick refresher course about the crisis. And the origins certainly lie in the rapid rise of house prices in the US in 2005 and 2006, and I think unsafe lending practices. Because what had happened is, as house prices rose rapidly, financial institutions started to make loans that were really only sensible if house prices kept rising. And the same thing pretty much happened in the United Kingdom. As a result, when house prices began to fall in 2007, borrower defaults started to rise, and at some point, investors lost confidence in the solvency of financial institutions. And when Lehman Brothers ran into so much trouble that they had to declare bankruptcy, all hell broke loose. And the financial system froze. Firms couldn't get credit to invest, to buy raw materials, even to cover payroll. Consumers couldn't get credit to buy cars or homes or even big ticket items. And very quickly, the trouble on Wall Street spread to Main Street in the United States, and from there to the rest of the world. When firms and households can't get credit to spend and produce, output falls and unemployment rises. And I remember vividly when the magnitude of the crisis really hit me. So it came at the end of my very first week in Washington. And that morning, we'd gotten the US employment statistics for November of 2008. And we learned that we'd not only lost 500,000 jobs in November, we also learned that the numbers for September and October had been overstated, and so that we'd actually lost another 250,000 jobs. So all told, employment was down some 750,000 jobs relative to what we had thought just the night before. And I was pulled out of a meeting to brief the president-elect, who was still in Chicago, by phone on the numbers. And I was practically babbling. I just kept saying, I'm so sorry, this is awful. Oh, I'm so sorry, the world's falling apart. And at one point, finally, the President Obama stopped me and he said, Christy, it's not your fault. Yet. Well, the pain inflicted by the crisis on ordinary families was just enormous. And again, in case you forget, this just kind of shows you the unemployment rate in a number of countries in 2009. And in most countries, it was incredibly high. In the United States, it was 9.3%. In Ireland, it was over 12%. In Brazil, it was 8%. Australia was actually among the lucky ones with unemployment below 6%, but still elevated. And even in countries with relatively generous unemployment benefits, a prolonged spell of unemployment just takes a terrible toll on families' standards of living and financial security. Now, ironically, because this lecture is part of the grand challenge on inequality, inequality actually fell in most countries during and soon after the financial crisis. So here's another picture. So this figure is going to show you the share of income going to the top 10% of households in a number of countries. And I've drawn in a line at 2007 so you can see where the crisis starts. And what you can see is that the share of income going to the top of the income distribution did decline in most countries. So that blue line is the United States. We had a quite substantial drop. Australia's down at the bottom, but it also had a drop. And that actually isn't very surprising. So if you think about it, the rich tend to get most of their income from returns to capital, and those returns, along with stock prices, plummeted during the crisis. Now, importantly, you can also see that inequality has started going back up again in most countries. And I'll discuss in a minute that I think some of the long-lasting effects of the crisis that I'll be talking about may be a factor in why inequality is rising again now and is likely to continue doing so in the years to come. All right, so that's inequality. Now, another important point, since we're thinking about economic well-being, is that the typical family in many countries suffered greatly in the post-crisis downturn. So median family income is, I think, a really important statistic. It's the income of the family right in the middle of the income distribution. And this picture shows you real median family income in the United States. And real just means that the figures have been adjusted for inflation, so they're comparable over time. And what you can see, that red bar is kind of showing you the period of the crisis, and what you can certainly see is that median family income really plummeted during the crisis. And the same is true not just in the United States, but in many other countries. And to my mind, median family income is perhaps an even more important statistic than measures of income inequality, because it's a direct measure of how ordinary families are faring. Are they able to afford a decent place to live, to send their kids to college, to retire with security? Are they doing better than their parents? Can they expect their children to do better than they did? I think all of these things are central to people's sense of their economic well-being. Okay, so those are some of the short-term consequences of the crisis. What about some of the longer-term impacts? And here it's important to say, for most countries, that acute downturn, though it was awful and very protracted, did finally end. So in the United States, real GDP started to grow again, actually in mid-2009. And today in the US, the unemployment rate is down to a very normal or perhaps even a particularly healthy level of 4.3%. Now, most countries, like the United States, started to grow again within about 2 years of the financial crisis. So emerging economies like Mexico and India and Brazil actually turned around particularly quickly and helped to lead much of the world out of the crisis. Australia is an example of one of the advanced countries that also recovered very quickly. An important exception to this pattern are the countries of Southern Europe. So Greece, Portugal, Spain, and Italy have all continued to languish. So if you don't know the numbers, that's the picture of the unemployment rate in those 4 Southern European countries. And what you can see is, though the unemployment rate even there has started to come down, they're still incredibly high in historical perspective, which many of the rates well over 10%, and some, such as Greece, nearing 25%. And I think actually the best interpretation is that these countries are still not completely through their post-crisis recessions. And I think because their financial systems were so devastated and their budget situations were so bad, they've just not been able to shake the downturn. And I think they're still suffering from low demand and below normal production. So if you want one long-term consequence of the crisis, is that some countries are still in the midst of recession, some 9 years later. Another long-term consequence involves a permanent loss in output and income. And what do I mean? Well, normally when an economy experiences a large drop in output, such as in a recession, such as we had in 2009, it has a large rise in output during the recovery. And so here's a picture of US real GDP around our 1980 recession. So go back 25 or more years. And what you can see there, and what I've sketched in that red line, so the blue line is actual GDP, and the red line is there to kind of give you a sense of the trajectory that the economy was on before the crisis. And what you can see is that in the early 1980s, we certainly had a very bad recession then as well, but notice that we also had a very rapid and strong recovery. And the effect was that we did eventually get back to that same upward trajectory that we had been on before the recession. And that's really the typical pattern for most recessions and for most countries. This recession, however, was different. Right? So this picture's going to show you, again, US real GDP around the 2008 crisis and recession. And again, I've put in that red line to give you a sense of the upward trajectory that we were on before the crisis. And notice that, again, output fell, but then when it started to grow again, we never had that period of rapid bounce back. When we started to grow, we grew at a very measured, kind of normal pace. And as a result, if you look at where we are today, we're sort of permanently below that previous trajectory. It looks as though we just essentially lost a chunk of output and we're never getting it back, right? That trend GDP, if you want, has just shifted down by a substantial amount. And many other countries, such as the UK, Canada, and Japan, look a lot like the United States. And in case you're interested, even Australia looks somewhat like this. So this is Australian real GDP, and again, I've sketched in a red line to suggest the trend that Australia had been on before the crisis, and its recession was much more mild, but even there you don't seem to have had that bounce back to the previous trajectory. Well, this effect on real GDP in a number of countries has a parallel effect on median family income, that sort of crucial statistic on the living standards of the typical family. I think as a result, the typical family has seen a drop in their real income relative to the path that they had been on before the crisis. So I think another long-term consequence of the crisis for economic well-being is that ordinary families are doing poorly relative to what they would have reasonably expected, say, a decade ago. And this is bound to make them feel less secure and less confident in the future. And I suspect it may help explain why people in many countries are yearning for the past, voting for candidates who vow to turn back the clock on things like trade, immigration, and technological change. All right, a third long-term consequence of the downturn for well-being involves the labor market in a number of advanced economies. So a prolonged period of unemployment, such as we had after the 2008 crisis, can lead to permanent problems in the labor market. So for example, one of the things that we've seen in many countries is a decline in the labor force participation rate. So the participation rate is just the fraction of the adult population that's either working or actively looking for work. And one of the things that's happened in many countries following the crisis is that many workers, particularly less educated men, have left the labor force. And so this figure is going to show you the labor force participation rate for men between the ages of 25 and 54. And what you can see is it's declined in many countries, particularly the two at the bottom, the dark blue lines, again, the United States. The light purple line is Italy, but a number of other countries have also seen a drop in their prime age male labor force participation rate. Now, obviously, there's a question of whether the decline is the result of the crisis or mainly just a continuation of some of the pre-existing trends. But a number of studies that have been done, at least that I know for the United States, have suggested that prolonged unemployment may have played a role in this, what seems to be an acceleration of this trend. Because people who were out of work for long periods of time saw their skills deteriorate, and so job opportunities became fewer. Some became so discouraged that they stopped trying to find a job altogether. And in the US in particular, many of our long-term unemployed have developed alcohol and drug problems that make it essentially impossible for them to ever work again. Now, another thing that we've seen in labor markets in many countries is a big rise in youth unemployment. So this picture is going to show you the unemployment rate for people at the beginning of their working years, ages 15 to 24. And the blue bar is showing what it was in 2006 before the crisis, and the red bar shows you what it is in 2016. And what you can see is that the unemployment rate for young people has certainly gone up in most countries and gone up just astronomically in the countries of Southern Europe. Those four big red bars are Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. If you just look at the magnitude of these numbers, we're talking numbers of 40 to 50% in some of these countries for the unemployment rate of young people. Right? And I think some of the very high rates of youth unemployment worldwide, I think, are likely the result of the fact that a lot of these young workers came of working age at a time when jobs were hard to find. And as a result, they didn't acquire the skills and the job experience that would allow them to find jobs easily. Moreover, there's evidence that workers who came of age at a time of high unemployment are permanently scarred. So, for example, they tend to earn less over much of their career and have lower job attachment. Well, if you think about these trends that I've talked about, these long-run impacts of the crisis on the labor market, declining labor force participation and rising youth unemployment, both of those may be ones that are likely to exacerbate inequality going forward. If people are not in the labor force, or if they're permanently scarred from coming of age during a time of high unemployment, they're likely to be low earners during the future. And this is going to tend to exacerbate the trend toward unequal income. All right, so those are some of the long-run consequences. Given both the terrible short-run unemployment and these long-run consequences, the long-run pain that the crisis inflicted on people throughout the world, it seems only right to critically evaluate the policy response. So what did policymakers get right, and what did they do wrong, or where did we fall short? So let me start with the positives. So the first is that monetary policy, that response was fast and aggressive. Central banks throughout the world flooded the financial system with liquidity to try to stop the panic, and they reduced interest rates very rapidly to try to stimulate growth. So this figure, in case you don't know the numbers, this shows you the policy interest rate set by a number of major central banks around the crisis. And what you can see is that leading up to the crisis and right after the crisis, they just dropped interest rates like a rock. And in fact, in most countries, interest rates came very close to zero, and in fact are still very close to zero. Right? Likewise, and this absolutely helped to stop the panic and helped to foster some of the recovery. Likewise, most countries engaged in active fiscal stimulus. So fiscal stimulus just refers to either cuts in taxes or increases in government spending. Sort of anything that increases the budget deficit is expansionary fiscal policy or fiscal stimulus. And the way fiscal stimulus is supposed to work is that it increases demand, and by doing so, that stimulates production. All right, so this figure is going to show you how much fiscal stimulus was done in a number of countries, and it's expressed as a share of GDP, so you can kind of get a sense of how big the fiscal stimulus was relative to the size of the economy. All right, and so you can see, for example, for the United States, we had a fiscal stimulus of about 2% of GDP in 2009. We did another 3% in 2010. Australia is a country that did a particularly large and particularly fast fiscal stimulus. China and South Korea are two other countries that had very aggressive fiscal stimulus. And there's a lot of evidence, both from previous episodes and from the 2009 episode, that this fiscal stimulus was incredibly helpful. And one study that was done when I was at the Council of Economic Advisors looked at whether countries that took more aggressive fiscal stimulus did better during and after the crisis. And so what we did is to group countries into high, medium, and low amounts of stimulus, and then look at what GDP growth was like in the middle of 2009. And what you can see is that the high stimulus countries, and as I said, Australia is one of the countries in that bucket, did substantially better than the medium and low stimulus countries. And I think the fact that countries throughout the world in 2009 all took quite aggressive monetary actions and many took aggressive fiscal actions is a big reason why that terrible post-crisis recession wasn't even worse than it actually was. So now, saying that the policy response was helpful is not the same thing as saying that it was truly good. And so there are certainly ways that policy fell short and absolutely should have been better. I think one obvious failing is that the fiscal stimulus in most countries was too small. And so let me take the case I know best, which is the United States. Even at the time that we were designing our Recovery Act, we knew that it was likely to only fill about half of the anticipated shortfall in demand caused by the crisis. And as it turned out, the actual shortfall was substantially larger than anyone had predicted. So to have helped the economy more quickly and thoroughly, we should have had a fiscal expansion roughly twice as large as we had. And a number of countries should also have been more aggressive. A related shortcoming is that stimulus measures, particularly fiscal stimulus, stopped too soon. Right? And again, the history here is that in May of 2010, Greece faced a run on its government bonds. The country's budget was a disaster, and Greek officials were found to have actively lied to cover up the situation. Now, the rest of the world, rather than viewing this as an unusual one-off situation, decided that we were all at risk of becoming the next Greece. And so country after country decided that the middle of a terrible recession was the perfect time to try to get the budget deficit down. And this picture shows you the change in the high employment budget deficit for a number of countries. So what is this? Well, the high employment deficit is the deficit that a country would have if it were at full employment. That is, it takes out the fact that the deficit naturally tends to rise when people are out of work and they're not paying taxes. Right? So a fall in the high employment budget deficit, that is a negative change, means that the country is reducing its budget deficit, or it's either raising taxes or cutting government spending. Right? So it's having a fiscal contraction, the opposite of fiscal stimulus. And to help you be able to spot those fiscal contractions more easily, I've put them in red, and you're supposed to see there's a giant sea of red in this picture after 2010. So for example, look at the UK. In 2010, that's when David Cameron comes in and puts in quite an austerity budget. The United States, in 2011, our Recovery Act ends, and that by itself is a big fiscal contraction. And then we also decide to raise taxes, and in 2013, we have an across-the-board cut in spending. The big losers, if you want, or the worst case examples of countries having fiscal expansion are those countries of Southern Europe that we've talked about. So Greece, Portugal, and Spain, all three of them as a requirement of getting aid both from the IMF or the European Union, had to take quite contractionary fiscal policy. And just look at the size of those fiscal contractions. We're talking as many as 10 or more percent of GDP, or over 6 to 7% of GDP in particular years, and then the cumulative effect is just a tremendous fiscal contraction. And I think the result was completely predictable. Remember those numbers that I showed you on the unemployment rate in exactly these same countries of Southern Europe? When they started to move to fiscal contraction, we saw their economies start to go back into recession. To my mind, the widespread switch to fiscal austerity in 2010 and after was the great failure of the policy response to the crisis. That policy, which had been so aggressive and so positive in 2009, became a contributing factor to continued recession. And I think if policymakers hadn't lost their nerve, I think a tremendous amount of suffering and long-term loss would likely have been avoided. Right, now a third failing of policy, I think again particularly in the United States, had to do with the focus of our recovery measures. I think not enough was done to try to keep people attached to the labor force. And here I want to draw a contrast to what was done in Germany. So Germany has a long-established work-sharing program called Kurzarbeit, or short work. And what it does is to encourage firms to keep workers employed part-time rather than lay them off entirely. And then the government pays the rest of their wage. And the program was used extensively in the 2008 recession. And the effect was that workers continued to have a relationship with their employers and to maintain their skills and to maintain their attachment to the labor force. And as a result, when demand picked up, most of them sort of went seamlessly back to work full-time. And there's a fair amount of evidence and suggestion that the Kurzarbeit program may have been one of the reasons that Germany has not suffered as many of the labor market pathologies that we've seen in other advanced economies. Now, in the United States, we tried to deal with the fallout from the crisis by stimulating demand more broadly through things like tax cuts and government spending. And we absolutely also tried to cushion the effect on unemployed workers by extending the duration and generosity of unemployment benefits. But one of the things that I wish we could have done was to have had a program that kept more workers employed and attached to the labor force. So such as widespread job training or job sharing, or even public employment. And we actually tried to come up with a system of public employment. So one of my specialties is the Great Depression, and so I had a great sense of what Franklin Roosevelt had been able to do in the 1930s of putting people directly back to work. And so we kept trying to think of ways that we could have a large-scale public employment program. We just couldn't seem to come up with something that we could do fast enough and on a significant scale. And actually, at one point in desperation, I started calling around to cabinet secretaries. And I would ask them, I'd say, if funding were available, how many people could your agency or department put to work, directly doing something useful? And a typical answer I got back was, oh, tons, 3,000 or 4,000. And at 3,000 or 4,000, we've got 15 million unemployed people. That's not going to get us very far. But I suspect that keeping people employed in some meaningful sense in my country and others would not only have eased the short-run pain of the recession, but might well have prevented some of the long-term consequences associated with prolonged unemployment. Okay, so that's sort of how we got here. The last thing I want to talk about is sort of where do we go from here? Given we can't turn back the clock and take better policies in the past, what do we do now about some of the lingering effects of the crisis? All right, well, the first one I want to mention has to do with monetary policy and the idea that monetary policy should, in fact, remain expansionary. It's an interesting thing that after just decades of worrying about inflation being too high, central banks in most advanced economies seem to have trouble realizing that they have a very different problem on their hands today. And that is that inflation is, in fact, too low in many countries. So this picture is going to show you what economists refer to as core inflation in a number of countries. The United States, Japan, the Euro area. I put in France since the Euro area didn't exist before 1997. And core inflation, in case you're wondering, just means that we've taken out the very volatile energy and food prices. Right? And then the interesting thing, all of these countries' central banks have a target rate for inflation of around 2%. And what I want you to notice is that basically since the crisis, in most countries, inflation has in fact been below 2%. Today in Japan, inflation is actually negative. In the Euro area, it's hovering around 1%. And even in the United States, it's coming in at sort of 1.7%. Nevertheless, central banks throughout the world are talking about moving away from monetary expansion towards monetary contraction and raising interest rates. And in fact, in the United States last month, we just raised our policy interest rate, the federal funds rate, on the very same day that we got an inflation report that showed that prices had literally fallen in the previous month. And I think that is a mistake. Because I think rather than worrying about inflation that has so far failed to materialize, monetary policymakers do need to continue to run expansionary policy. So they should keep interest rates low and perhaps even take some additional measures to increase the availability of credit, or certainly in countries where credit availability is still a problem. And in my mind, what they ought to be doing is testing the waters a bit, if you want, to see if they can push the unemployment rate in their country down further without generating inflation that's substantially above their target. What's the benefit of this strategy? Well, I suspect that a high-pressure economy might yet draw people back into the labor force. If we can, through policy actions, make the unemployment rate lower, make jobs easier to get, make wages a little bit higher, that may help to draw workers who've become discouraged back into the labor force to get them to start looking for jobs again. And I think that would be obviously great for the people involved, but it's also great for the health of their overall economy. Now, a second way I think we need to move forward is to focus policy on economic growth. And I'm sure if you've been to more of these lectures, I think much of the discussion these days is about redistributing income through things like a higher minimum wage, more progressive taxes, and a more generous social safety net. And given how much inequality has risen, particularly in English-speaking advanced economies, that focus is understandable and absolutely laudable, and I strongly support those measures. But I think if one cares about the standard of living for the typical family, it turns out that stimulating growth is even more important than that kind of redistribution. And to help you understand that, a couple of years ago, the Council of Economic Advisors did a very illuminating exercise that tried to understand the stagnation of median family income in the United States. And what they did was two counterfactuals, right? So for one, they asked, all else equal, if the distribution of income today were the same as it was back in 1973, so before we had the big rise in inequality, how much higher would median family income be? How much better off would the typical family be? And the answer was about 18%, right? For the other counterfactual, they said, all else equal, including the current actual distribution of income, if productivity growth, which is the main determinant of GDP growth, had been the same between 1974 and 2013 as it was during the high growth period right after World War II, how much higher would median family income be? And the answer to that was about 58% higher. So what that points out is that overall GDP growth is incredibly important for standards of living for the typical family. All right, so if that's the case, what kinds of government policies would help to raise productivity growth and thus increase income throughout the income distribution? And to my mind, the most important is really investment of all sorts. So we need investment in people, the things that we do here at universities. Education and technical training, I think, are the closest thing we have to a magic bullet, both for productivity growth and for greater income equality. We also need more investment in basic scientific research. Again, something that happens in universities such as this. One of the things I think is so important to realize is the private sector has a tremendous incentive to do research and development on things that they can patent and sell, right? But they don't have the same kind of incentives to do the basic scientific research that lies behind those more marketable advances. Basic scientific research is inherently a free good that everyone can use. So for that reason, if the government doesn't fund that research, basically no one will. But such research in basic science is essential for economies to keep coming up with new discoveries and new technologies that can fuel economic growth. Likewise, we need more investment in infrastructure in many countries. So public infrastructure, everything from the quintessential roads and bridges and airports to an advanced power grid, clean energy, GPS satellites, those kind of things are things, again, that the private sector is unlikely to do on its own, but that are incredible sources of growth. And I'll just tell you, some studies in the United States, for example, have looked at the returns to public money spent on building highways and maintaining highways in urban areas. And it turns out the rate of return on that investment is somewhere between 15 and 35%. Which is higher than the rate of return on basically any other investment. Now, one policy that is often mentioned as a boost to growth are tax cuts, particularly for the wealthy. And this is certainly an idea that is having incredible durability in the United States and has, in fact, been proposed by the Trump administration. And the idea is that lower taxes will encourage entrepreneurs to work harder and come up with more ideas because they're allowed to keep more of the rewards. And I certainly find this view very frustrating because tax cuts do absolutely raise output in the short run, but there's essentially no evidence that they stimulate long-run growth. And indeed, there is study after study in economics that the long-run effects of tax cuts on income are precisely estimated to be very small. And I think in light of this evidence, it's highly irresponsible for politicians to keep advocating tax cuts as the cure for anemic growth, particularly since tax cuts for the wealthy would inevitably increase the already disturbing trend toward greater inequality. All right, a final set of policies that I want to mention and recommend are those that deal with those long-run problems in the labor market that I mentioned, that are there in a number of countries. As I've described, one of the consequence of this period of very prolonged unemployment is that we've seen high youth unemployment and we've seen older workers, some of them withdraw from the labor force entirely. And we need serious policies to help those workers and to get them back in to meaningful work. And that increased investment that I talked about in education and job training would certainly help. I think there's a lot of evidence, particularly if the job training is well coordinated with local employers, that it can be very effective. Something else, though, that I think economists are talking a lot more about these days are what are called place-based policies. They're policies that are aimed at helping particularly troubled communities. Because one of the things that we know is that unemployment is often concentrated in particular cities or regions. It turns out that sometimes the best way to help the workers is to actually help the whole community. So for example, some recent research by my Berkeley colleague Patrick Klein and others has looked at a program we had in the United States back in the 1990s that were called empowerment zones. And this was a program that you were nominated, an area would be nominated for, they'd get a big chunk of money, and it could be used both to help businesses get capital, maybe to build infrastructure, to provide job training. It also included wage subsidies. So if you hired workers, if you were a firm in one of these zones and you hired workers that lived in that zone, part of their wages would be paid by the government. And the results were that it worked quite well. And what's so nice about this study, it was a program where you got nominated to be in it, and then some people got it and some people didn't, or some areas got it in a later round. And so what the researchers can do, they have like the perfect control. They can look at the areas that got the money and the areas that just barely didn't get the money. So they were good enough to get nominated, but they didn't get the pot. And what comes out is that they were very effective. So this is just one of the results. And this one says that in terms of jobs, the Empowerment Zone program increased employment relative to the similar zones that didn't get the money by about 20%. And likewise, there were kind of similar numbers on what it did to wages. So what all of this suggests is that perhaps a way that you can help some of the workers that are being permanently harmed by the prolonged unemployment during the crisis would be to spend money wisely on these place-based policies. All right, so where does all this leave us? Well, remember I described earlier the terror I felt when that first employment report came out in December of 2008. I also remember vividly the first time we got some encouraging news. So it was in December of 2009, exactly a year later, and private forecasters had been predicting that when that employment report came out, we were going to find out that we'd lost another 150,000 jobs in November 2009. But when the numbers came across my desk, they were much less bad than expected. And I dashed over to the Oval Office to give the president the news, and I shouted, "We only lost 11,000 jobs!" And you would have thought I had given him the best news ever. So I literally got 4 hugs and a kiss. I think that seemed at that moment as if the nightmare was finally ending. Now, as I've described today, some of the promise of that December night has in fact been realized. The acute recession caused by the financial crisis is over for most countries, thanks in large part to the aggressive policy response. But some of the pain absolutely still lingers today, some 9 years after the crisis. A few countries are still in recession, and many families are still not back to the standard of living that they had in 2007. Moreover, I think the lasting damage to skills and labor force participation risk exacerbating current trends toward rising inequality. And I feel deeply that we owe it to these families to not yet give up the fight to restore our economies to robust growth and secure employment prospects, because only then will the 2008 crisis truly be over. Thank you.
Christina, thank you so much for that wonderful address. ANU Vice-Chancellor and Nobel laureate Brian Schmidt commented yesterday after your talk at APRU that one of the great traditions that the US has is to have great scholars become policymakers and then go back to being great scholars again. And I think tonight was another great example of that. We're going to have a few minutes for questions from the floor, and there are 2 microphones on either side of the room, so I'll ask people interested in asking Christina a question to make their way towards those. As people do that, let me be cheeky and get in first.
Okay.
So I was particularly struck, let me try and draw together 2 strands of your talk. I was particularly struck by your chart showing the no rapid bounce back. Mm-hmm. You know, we come post-crisis, we start growing again, but we're just sort of seemingly permanently below that trend line. And that seems to be true not just in the US, but in a number of other advanced countries. And so if I interpret you right, one of your prescriptions is We need to have more infrastructure spending. We need to invest more in education and basic science and these other labour market policies and so on. But you also said we need to be able to have a big and forceful stimulus if the next crisis happens. So how do we reconcile those two things? How do we keep spending the way that we need to stimulate demand in that way, and if you like, keep our powder dry for next time around? Or do we need a different way of thinking about government finances?
All right, so it's a great question, and I think there are a couple of things going on. So I think in trying to I've thought a lot about that picture, and I have to confess, I don't think economists really understand where this came from, right? It does look like, the way I described it, we just lost some output, and whether that's because people dropped out of the labor force or whether, we didn't invest for a number of years and we've just never, and now firms don't have the confidence to have that bounce back in investment. But I think partly we don't understand it. I'm less sure, I used to be sure that it was a demand shortfall, which is where your question was going. And I suspect what I was trying to allude to, I think that is probably true in some countries, like the countries of Southern Europe. I doubt that that's really what's going on, say, in the United States. So for there, I think the focusing on investment of all sorts and getting people back into the labor force, that's why I'm so passionate about things like the place-based policies or job training or anything to get people back into the labor force. I think that would help you get back up. As you rightly point out, those things are expensive, and that's absolutely true. So I think that's part of why, and I actually had it in my talk, that's part of why it's even more irresponsible to talk about cutting taxes now, say for the wealthy, because a lot of our countries do have big budget deficits, and if anything, we need to be raising taxes. And if you raise taxes in a progressive way, that could have the double benefit of helping your budget and reducing inequality. I think the other thing we need is reorienting budgets so that we absolutely need to spend more on the good stuff, which I think is investment. I think it's kids. We often, in advanced economies especially, we tend to be spending a lot on the elderly and not nearly enough, especially in the United States, on young people. And I think inevitably we've got to have that kind of a rebalancing. So I think we need to ask the people that are able to work longer or wealthier people in the United States to pay more for their health care if they're elderly, rather than shortchanging the kind of investment in our kids that would help with inequality and help with growth. So I think that's how you balance this, but it requires some hard choices by politicians.
So I'll ask those asking questions to make their way to the microphone. First question, Leon Berkelmans from the Reserve Bank of Australia.
Not asking the question in that capacity, of course, Richard.
Especially since I talked about monetary policy. So.
Exactly. So I want to ask about productivity growth, actually.
Yeah.
So you showed that slide up there with that great statistic from the economic report of the President highlighting the importance of TFP growth, of productivity growth. I'm wondering to what degree you think the techno-pessimists like Bob Gordon have a point.
So for those of you that don't know Bob Gordon, so he's been famous for saying, that all the good inventions were done in the 20th century, and that, after the toilet and the internal combustion engine, it was like all downhill from there. And I like my indoor plumbing as much as anyone, but I think I'm not in that group. I think if you just think about where we stand with, the human genome and the revolutions we're having in medicine and things like that, I guess I come back to, I don't think all the good things have been discovered. But when you look at the picture, so we talked about how there's just like this level shift. So it looked like we were on one trend and it just shifted down. If you really look at that line, it also looks like it flattened out some. And we definitely have seen productivity growth slow down in a lot of countries. And I don't think we completely understand that. I feel for the United States, The fact that we haven't been investing in infrastructure and we haven't been investing, nearly as much in basic science, I think that I firmly believe, I mean, we don't have the magic bullet, but that's the closest I have to it. But it certainly is something that worries me. But before I said we're just all, it's hopeless, let's go dig a hole and hide, I think we ought to try what has worked in the past, which is education, research, infrastructure. I'm certainly incentives for private firms to do investment and R&D. All of those things are as close as I have to helping us get productivity up. And I like to believe it's going to work, and I guess in my heart I think it will, but I can't promise.
Over here, sir.
Thank you. Tibor Molnar, Sydney University. We in Australia are very politically correct, and we're very careful with our four-letter words. One of them is work. And you spoke about work, and you spoke about how unemployment costs an economy and how things aren't working quite as well as they should be. The other four-letter word that is fairly frequently on people's lips in Australia is debt. And I noticed that in your talk you didn't talk very much about debt. You are speaking about how to improve things we need to invest in education, and we need to invest in infrastructure, and we need to invest in our children and research. Yes, of course we do. But it seems to me that many countries around the world, perhaps particularly in the OECD, are no longer in a position where they can do that quite as easily as they used to. One of the changes that happened at the GFC is that economies that were somehow working on investment and growth suddenly started being driven by debt. And debt, both at government levels and at individual levels now, is I think at record highs. It certainly is in Australia. Personal debt is now so high that it doesn't matter if the government drops interest rates, people can't afford to borrow money anyway. Because they've already got so much debt, or they've already got 10 credit cards maxed out to the limit. So what are they going to do? And what are we going to do? And what do you suggest the role of debt is in all of this?
Okay, that's an incredibly important question. So I think there are a couple of things to say. I mean, you won't get any argument from me that debt's a problem. And in fact, I like to think of myself as one of the rare people that is a strong proponent of fiscal stimulus and genuinely cares about the budget deficit. And one of the things that I talked a lot about during the crisis and soon after is sort of there's the right timing of things. And exactly what made me so mad about what happened in 2010, that was the wrong time to try to deal with your debt, right? So the right time to deal with large budget deficits are in good times, and absolutely in good times, we should be running much more responsible policy. And I have been on a number of panels where they'd put a Republican economist next to me, and the two of us could agree completely. Over the long run, you need to trim our entitlement spending. You're going to have to raise our taxes. You're going to have to cut wasteful government spending. So the package that you'd need to do to get debt down for most advanced economies, we know what it is, and it absolutely needs to be done. There's a question about when. So one of the things that was very striking, say, in the countries of Southern Europe, right? As part of a lot of the rescue packages, they were forced to take austerity. In fact, in many cases, it made the problem, if not worse, at least no better, because when you have big tax increases and big cuts in government spending, unemployment went up, tax revenues went down, and lo and behold, their deficit doesn't go down, even though they're taking very contractionary policy. So I think that's the trade-off that you're playing, at least in the short run, is that it can be very devastating. But absolutely, and it's where Richard started, we absolutely need to be moving towards a much more sensible kind of budget package, and that absolutely has the good stuff that's important for the productivity growth that we talked about. You've got to support basic science and education and those kind of things, but you are going to have to raise taxes on the people that can afford it, and you are going to have to cut some of the goodies for people that don't need them. And I think that is just, that's a really hard thing to do, but it's what has to be done. Your point on the private, so that's the public debt, and that's a hard problem. The private debt is also a really interesting thing, and one of the things that's been so interesting being in Australia now, I mean, private debt's come down a lot in the United States, and debt loads are down substantially. And so reading your newspaper has certainly been, something I was aware of, but it was certainly eye-opening the degree to which it has gone up. And that is certainly, that's a problem. And it's particularly, I think, one of the things that we learned in the aftermath of the crisis, high debt loads do tend to hold back consumer spending, right? If you're already indebted, you're afraid to take on more, you don't buy stuff. And that then can make your economy slow down. And so figuring out sort of how to manage that, I think, is going to be a challenge for a country like Australia. One of the things, I guess, if I wanted to have a reassuring note, a difference between what I see happening now, and again, I will admit to not being an expert on the Australian financial sector, but in the US in 2005 and 2006, we not only took on debt, we let our financial institutions be inadequately capitalized. We let them make loans to people with essentially no down payment. And so that was a really toxic combination, because then if asset prices drop, if house prices drop, your financial system is at risk. Where I think the whole world financial system, especially in advanced economies, is a lot stronger today. There are higher capital requirements. I've certainly been reading about measures that have been taken to raise down payment requirements and things like that. That at least protects the financial system, but it definitely is still messing up individuals and how they're going to feel about spending and making those important decisions going forward.
Jeff Harcourt.
Yep. Thank you very much. First of all, may I say thank you very much for a really inspiring talk. I want to make two comments. One is, when you mention the need for more infrastructure spending, I think one of the great opportunities missed from the spending was green-friendly infrastructure, because I believe, and I'm sure you do too, that climate change is the most, global warming is the most terrible problem facing the whole world. That's the first point I'd like you to comment on. Secondly, one of the real classics on what causes productivity change is a book by an Australian economist, long dead, Wilfred Salter, on productivity and technical change. And his point was that if you are committed to full employment, then as a starting point, incomes should increase by overall productivity plus prices if there's inflation going on, because if there's overall full employment, that means that the expanding high productivity industries get a fillip, and the declining, often low productivity, get knocked out, and that means that you go into a whole new ball game with higher real incomes, and it's both equitable and efficient.
All right, so let me start with your point about green investments. And I'll actually take you back to a meeting that we had with the president-elect. So the way the U.S., if you're not into your U.S. Presidential transitions, so the president's elected in November, doesn't take office until January 20th. And so there's this sort of interregnum. And so President Obama, or President-elect Obama, was still in Chicago, and everybody is in Washington. We're frantically trying to come up with a Recovery Act and all of this. And at some point, right, the entire team flies to Chicago to meet with him. And it was the most amazing, imagine a 6-hour meeting. By about hour 3, the rest of us are like about to, collapse. And he's just, getting going. But anyway, one of the things, we start to tell him, this is much worse than you thought. So, people had said maybe we should do a really big, fiscal stimulus of $300 billion, and our job was to tell him, no, it needs to be $800 billion. And, as he's incredibly smart, so he said, okay, I get you, I understand, but if we're going to be spending all that money, can't we do something useful with it, right? And his exact instinct was, let's build a whole new power grid, or let's build a high-speed rail line up and down the U.S. Northeast corridor. And I think one of the things that it fell to the economists is to say, we couldn't agree more, and you've got two things going on, which is those would be great things to do. They'd make us more productive in the future, but they're slow, right? It would take 20 years to build a high-speed rail line. And so what we tried to do, so in our Recovery Act at least, about $100 billion of it were for clean energy, kind of broadly defined. So we did try to meet the president's goal, at least in that way somewhat. I wish we could have done more. And I think if I were to take a lesson from this, I mean, God forbid that we ever face this again, but I think if we doing some planning now for figuring out how you could use, if you needed to stimulate your economy, how you could do it quickly in a way that isn't just digging ditches and filling it back in, is the number one thing. I'd have those things in reserve so that you're ready to just roll out something really useful. I'm not sure I know enough about the book you're citing, but I think the basic point that for productivity growth, that nice little counterfactual that we saw, that I showed you from the Council of Economic Advisors, that was really important in saying that productivity growth is what really matters for living standards for the typical family. But you shouldn't miss that part about the wages or incomes would be 18% higher if we had the same income distribution we'd had back in 1973. So income equality also matters, and I think one of the things that's been frustrating, say, as we've come out of the recession, is that the income growth that we've had has gone tremendously disproportionately to the top. So you've seen income inequality start to go up again, and that I think your point that wages need to keep up with productivity growth so that the typical family, that helps the typical family to be benefiting as well. And I think we shouldn't think of it as an either or. It's something we can have both of them. I was just trying to, I think it's so easy, maybe it comes from all these times of beating my head against Berkeley students that just want to redistribute income, and to explain that's great, that's important, but growth is also really important, and that you should understand that those policies matter as well.
Christina, we could go on and on, but we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming to UNSW, and for David coming as well. It was wonderful that we could be part of both of your first trip to Sydney. We certainly hope it won't be the last. Tell us when to send more tickets, and we'll make that happen. We wanted to give you a small token of our appreciation. I'm told I'm not meant to ruin the surprise, but there is something for you and something for the planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much.